This episode of Writing Excuses has been brought to you by our listeners, patrons, and friends. If you would like to learn how to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/writingexcuses. Hey listeners, we want your input on Season 20, which I have to be honest does not sound like a real number. What elements of the craft do you want us to talk about? What episode or core concept do you use or reference or recommend the most? Or what are you just having trouble with? After 20 seasons, we've talked about a lot of things. What element of writing do you wish we'd revisit for a deeper dive on the podcast? Email your ideas to podcast@writingexcuses.com. Season 19, Episode 20. This is Writing Excuses.
A close reading on world building, scale, how to make worlds feel big without overwhelming the reader.
15 minutes long.
Because you're in a hurry.
And we're not that smart.
I'm Mary Robinette.
I'm Dongwon.
I'm Dan.
And I'm Howard.
And today we're going to talk about scale and both establishing it and then maintaining it. And I want to start this episode by reading a little bit of the prelude to A Memory Called Empire, because she does such a wonderful job of establishing scale just right from the very first sentence, which is, in Takes Kalan, these things are ceaseless, star charts and disembarkments. And I love in particular that word ceaseless. Mm-hmm. The word endless would be accurate, sure. Space empires are huge, space itself is endless. But making it ceaseless tells us, well, let me ask, what do you think that word adds to this?
I also love the difference between ceaseless and unceasing. Unceasing would be the more common one. Mm-hmm. But ceaseless implies endless and relentless.
Mm-hmm.
Both.
Yes.
It is not just that Tix Kalan is an infinite empire. It is that it wills itself to that expansion. It is choosing to be unceasing by being ceaseless.
Without using the phrase, it sets up the proposed conflict of irresistible force meets immovable object by saying, here then is what an irresistible force looks like.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing that it did for me is that it says people are moving around like between stars constantly. Disembarkments and star charts. That this movement across vast spaces is, that for me gave me this really sense of this, this is an empire.
Yeah.
This is an interstellar empire.
And for me, what this really does is it starts off by establishing a scale not in space, but in time.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Not that this is an empire that has no end, but that it never stops, which is very different. The travel is constant. The expansion is constant. Everything is going to just keep going. Let me read the next sentence. Here is all of Takes Kalanli space spread out in holograph above the strategy table on the warship Ascension's Red Harvest. 5 jump gates and 2 weeks sublight travel away from Takes Kalan's city planet capital, about to turn around and come home. There's so much scale in that sentence as well.
It's remarkable how in 2 sentences she has established the nature, tenor, and scope of this empire, right? We've all spent time on cruise ships. The word disembarkment, I think, fills us with a certain level of sense of fear and tedium, right? That is also implied with that. We get a sense of bureaucracy. With this mention of a warship, we get a sense of how Tix Kalan is expanding its ceaseless borders.
Holograph also gives us another layer of technology that is available to people.
And then she says jump gate as a way of just, we're not going to talk about the technology of interstellar travel. We are not interested in that. That is not important to this book.
Yeah.
It's a doodad that gets you from point A to point B.
The thing that frightened me in that opening phrase was disembarkments are ceaseless. Embarkments weren't.
Yes.
The empire is vomiting itself outward. And that's the part that, sure, there's some people coming back, but it's
also who's disembarking, right? Is Is it soldiers? Is
I
it
imagined
tourists?
that
Is it
many of them
bureaucrats?
were soldiers, but yeah.
It asks all these questions so quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and this is where, for me at least, we really start to get a sense of the scale of space.
Yes.
Of physical
Yeah.
space. Because it's not just a jump gate, it's 5 jump gates and then 2 weeks of sublight travel. We are out in the boondocks of this civilization.
Yeah.
So far away from, the city planet capital, which again, the Coruscant idea. The entire planet is a city. That is the capital of this empire that has so many jump gates and still stretches at least 2 weeks sublight travel beyond the farthest jump gate.
And part of what I love about Memory Called Empire is that while the concept of city planet is not new to the genre, Coruscant, I forget the name of the world at the center of the Foundation Empire, thinking that because you have read it before, you have read this would be a terrible mistake.
Yeah.
A terrible, terrible mistake. And I loved so much the discovery that this was the planet city, the world city, the city world done differently, done freshly. It was delicious.
She's also leveraging those illusions, right?
Oh,
She's
yeah.
leveraging the fact that we've seen this before. She doesn't need to explain what a city world is. We've seen that on screen, right? She doesn't need to explain what a jump gate is. We know that. There's such shorthand here that's also very useful of establishing technology level, scope, all of these things.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the scale of time and the scale of space, and we've hinted at every step about like you said, the tone, the tenor of this particular civilization. So here's the third sentence of the book, which I think just brings everything home and really just hammers that nail in to demonstrate the scale of their ambition, which is the holograph is a cartographer's version of serenity. All these glitter-pricked lights are planetary systems, and all of them are ours.
Yeah. Yeah. The ownership of that. And also glitter pricked is such a specific phrase that says these are decorative baubles on the vastness of this empire.
Yeah. Well, and the word serenity as well, that when you are viewing it from this far away, when you're looking at it as a map or as a holograph, then sure, it is serenity. It is the Pax Imperium. We don't concern ourselves with the process of conquering or of colonization or of revolution or of maintaining the peace, because that's going to happen somewhere far away on a glitter-pricked light.
What does it mean for a warship called Ascension's Red Harvest to think of serenity? What has that ship done or represent to achieve the serenity that you can have when you're at that scale, right? Empires get to think about serenity because they have already rolled over anything that looked like opposition. They are the scale affords a bias of treating people like they are simple.
It is a little bit like eating hamburgers and fried chicken regularly and never having visited a butcher.
Exactly. And what I love is from this section, what we're immediately going to do is zoom into LaSalle Station.
Yeah.
There's this concept in architecture and interior design. Frank Lloyd Wright was very famous for this, of expansion and compression, right? You go from a large space, you compress someone into a narrow hallway, and then you let them emerge into a big open space, right? So when you walk into a Frank Lloyd Wright building, you will often be like, what is up with this hallway? Why is it so narrow and why is it so short? And the idea is that he was forcing you into a small space so that when you came out again on the other side, you would be in awe of how open and beautiful this common space that he had made was. And that effect is very much here in this book. I mean, Arcades also studied urban planning and architecture, and I think that shows even in the narrative structure of moving us from this massive scale on this opening sentence, and then we're going to go into a constrained space station as they are under pressure trying to figure out what to do about this demand from Empire before we return to Texcalan.
So I'm just going to read the introduction of LaSalle Station because I think, again, that contrast is really amazing. In Parsra-Wantalak sector lies Lascelles Station, one fragile turning jewel, a toroid 20 miles in diameter, rotating around a central spoke, hanging in the balance point between a handy sun and its nearest useful planet. And this is just one fragile turning jewel. So linking it back to that star chart, the glitter specks, but also 20 miles.
Yeah.
Like, we know how small that is. And also I thought in my own brain about the deliberateness of using imperial measurements at that point. 20 miles in diameter. And then the other piece that caught me in this section was not just that, but also the difference in the way that the captain of the ship is introduced versus the fourth sentence of the introduction. This scene, some captain staring out at a holograph recreation of Empire. And then she says, 100 such captains, 100 such holographs. So, like, saying this person is not important. This person is just a wheel, a piece in the cog. But right after we get introduced to this small toroid, this tiny, tiny thing, we get a shuttle spits itself from the station's spoke, travels a few hours' distance to the waiting gray and gold metal hulk of the warship, deposits its cargo, one human woman, some luggage, some instructions, and comes back again unharmed. And that's when you're like, okay, this one human woman is the person who's going to be important. And that narrowing down, the coming in, the way we're using language and scale to focus us on this person versus 100 captains. It's such a beautiful, beautiful use of scale to tell us what's important.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that technique of narrowing scale in the first chapter. But first, we are going to pause and take a little break.
Hey writers, are you thinking about learning a new language? I think exploring the world, experiencing other cultures, and being able to communicate with people outside your everyday experience lets you create richer, better stories. A great way to do that is with Rosetta Stone, a trusted expert for over 30 years with millions of users in 25 languages offered. They use an immersive technique which leads to fast language acquisition. It's an intuitive process that helps you really learn to speak, listen, and most of all, think in the language you're trying to learn. They also feature true accent speech recognition technology that gives you feedback on your pronunciation. It's like having a voice coach in your home. Learn at home or on the go with a desktop and mobile app that let you download and access lessons even when you're offline. And it's an amazing value. A lifetime membership gives you access to all 25 languages, including Spanish, French, Italian, German, Japanese, and, of course, Korean. Don't put off learning that language. There's no better time than right now to get started. For a very limited time, Writing Excuses listeners can get Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership for 50% off. Visit rosettastone.com/today. That's 50% off unlimited access to 25 language courses for the rest of your life. Redeem your 50% off at rosettastone.com/today.
It's recipe time. I love soft-boiled eggs, but I struggle to get them perfect because there are so many variables in play. Recently, I discovered an Instant Pot trick for reducing that to just one variable. The recipe goes like this. Put 1 1/2 cups of fridge-cold water in the Instant Pot. Put 2 to 6 eggs from the refrigerator on the little tray. Pressure cook for low on 1 minute, and then release the pressure after 90 seconds. Remove the eggs, I use tongs because hot, and put them in a bowl of fridge-cold water for 1 minute. Now, try them. If they're too runny, then for your next batch, increase the wait time for pressure release by 5 seconds. If they're too firm, reduce the wait time by 5 seconds. That one variable, how long you wait before releasing pressure, is the only one you need worry about. So after a couple of tries, you too will be making perfect soft-boiled eggs every time. Unless your refrigerator is really wobbly about temperature. I don't have a fix for that.
Hi, welcome back. We're talking about the scale of a memory called Empire. And I want to take a look at chapter 1, if we can. The prelude showed the one human woman, which is Mahit, leaving a space station and coming to Takes-Kalan city itself, the city planet capital. And this whole, well, maybe not the whole chapter, but a significant chunk of this is just her arriving. And I wanted to talk about this in terms of scale because we get to see Takes-Kalan in several different ways as she draws closer and closer to it, which helps with the scale a lot. The first thing is basically she gets, she's in some kind of little drop pod or landing transport that leaves Ascension's Red Harvest and then breaks atmosphere and starts coming down. And Takes-Kalan is described at this point in almost mythological terms. This is the way that we see it in our dreams. This is the way that it is presented in movies or in, legendary stories. And then the closer that she gets to it, we start to see it in different ways.
And the things that Arcady is doing within that section to demonstrate the difference between Mahit and the giant kind of grinding nature of the Empire. Like when we talk about when she's the tiny little shuttle thing that she's in, like spits out, and she sees the giantness of the city. But then when she's in process, we've got this whole section where there's some business with the siege skiff being shunted into a long line of other such vessels, moving along a great conveyor until each one could be identified and come to its assigned gate. And that circles back to that thing about disembarkments from the very beginning, that this is a massive process, that she's just a seed almost that's being spat into the Empire to try to take root.
Well, when you look at something like Star Wars, we don't see a lot of this, right? You don't see bureaucracy. I think that's why Andor was such an exciting show for a lot of us, because suddenly we were like, oh, it takes stuff to make an empire of this scale run. And so right from the jump, Arcady is communicating to us one of the most important things about this world is military power, because we have Ascension's Red Harvest. But maybe even more than that, how much of a pain in the ass it is to do anything in this world because of how many layers of bureaucracy it requires to view entire planets, entire systems as these pinpricks of light.
I was reminded of my first business trip to New York City back when I was a tech guy, and one of the guys I was with punched me in the kidney and said, "Dude, stop looking up." I'm like, why? It's amazing. He says, "You look like a tourist and you're marking us." And his concern was that by me just soaking up the magnificence of all these tall buildings, I was making myself a target potentially for pickpockets. I don't know if he was right, but that phrase, "stop doing that, it makes you look like a tourist," came back to me when I thought of Mahit on Takes-Kalan, because there are things she is going to look at and be amazed by that everybody else just takes for granted.
Well, just the sky.
Exactly. She's never seen a sky this color, right? And going back to what Dan was saying about the way culture is part of this, right? Her appreciation of the epics, of the poetry, of the history, which we're seeing in this sort of mythological tone approaching the city. We're seeing it from her perspective in that way. That is absolutely influencing how she experiences this, how she, there's a poem later referenced that is just a poem about the buildings and architecture of Takes-Kalan. And that is something that is so resonant for her that she's heard all of these structures described in poetic verse that she has memorized at some point, right?
Yeah.
Well, and also that moment with the where she's describing all of the things via poetry, it's also like a 45-minute drive.
Yeah.
So again, you get this sense of, okay, so wait, this person has memorized a 45-minute and hasn't finished the poem. Yeah. It's just...
Yeah.
Like, again, the sense of scale and what's important, the values.
Well, and as befits Takes-Kalan culture, this kind of sense of being shocked at how beautiful it is part of their propaganda. Let me read a little bit here. The city appeared exactly as it was always described in Teixcatlanli documents and songs. The jewel at the heart of the empire, complete with atmospheric glow. That's what looking at it is meant to make you think, said her imago. And that's, yes, they have to wait in line to get in, but they have to wait in line here specifically so that they can be properly impressed by how amazing this city capital is. Later, let's talk more about this narrowing thing, because this is their first impression. And then they get closer down and, we start getting this, linguistic description. The word for world and the word for city were the same, as was the word for empire. Like, this is not just the city at the heart of the empire, but in a very strong cultural sense, this is the whole point of everything.
We're going to come back.
Is the empire.
We're going to come back and really drill down on that during an upcoming episode.
But the way in which she's using those tools to really communicate, this huge scope and the specific are the same. It's I'm blanking on the term. Is it synecdoche, that where the small thing contains the entirety of the big thing, right? In terms of linguistic sense, it's both synecdoche and metonymy at the same time, which is the inverse. It's all things that are contained in this small thing, and what she's telling us, the audience, there in these moments as Mahit is descending to the planet, is this is going to be a book about the entire empire. Also, we're compressing into one location.
Yeah.
We're gonna stay here. That's what everything about this opening is telling me, is we're not going to be bouncing from planet to planet. This is not an interplanetary adventure. This is a political novel that's going to take place in one place. And, one of the interesting tensions about this book, from an editorial perspective, as I was working on it and working with the editorial team on it, is the balancing between the need for an exciting and driving plot in this very spy thriller way that much of the action unfolds, and the primary concerns of the book, which are these galactic scale issues, right? So again, this trick of compression is very important so that we understand that the individual action of the book, the murder at the center of this book, is going to be one that has galactic consequence. And so she's using the world building to tell us, hey, here's what's important for the plot. I want you to start thinking about the scale of this empire. So when we spend the next 5 chapters talking about how one guy died, you're going to still be thinking about all the other stuff too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As an aside, this is where Arkady threw down a gauntlet for every writer in the room when she said the experience of looking at Teixcatlan is exactly as it was written in the poems. And as a writer, I'm like, oh God, if I could write a poem that did to you exactly what the experience did, I would have arrived as a writer. And that moment, for me, that set a very high bar. And I realized, that the height of that bar is important later, isn't it?
This is such an interesting thing about scale and scope of a world that we don't see that much in media, which is the use of storytelling and the use of pop culture, right?
Yeah.
The way pop culture can communicate scale. And that's something that she's done here in a really interesting way.
Yeah, I want to read the one sentence where we make this switch that Dongwon's talking about, from galactic scope to, the kind of the human scope. The city had come closer. It filled up the horizon, a vast curve she was falling into. We have spent pages describing planets as tiny pinpricks of light, and now this one city is so big that it is devouring her. It is completely consuming her. And she is, now we're getting that sense of the personal scale rather than the galactic scale.
Yeah, and then she does this other thing that is extremely important world building trick, which is after we've done all of that, that she gets out of the ship and she stepped onto the gate and thus into Teixcatlan itself. The Skyport gate had an airy utilitarianism constructed of wear-resistant carpet and clearly marked signage between glass and steel-paneled walls. And she takes all of this unfamiliar stuff, all of this strangeness, and says, you recognize this experience. And by penning that, dropping us like all of this exciting awe and wonder, it's like this is still going to be a ride that is familiar to you. And that also the juxtaposition between the awe and wear-resistant carpet, like we know that so well. It's such a good job of establishing scope and then bringing it down into the, here we go. Now we're into the business of the book.
Yeah. Well, and just to really let you know, if you haven't for some reason read this yet, the quote that I read and the quote that Mary Robinette read are 3 pages apart.
Yeah.
Because there's so much magnified detail going into every single step of this process.
Yeah.
Exactly. What I love is at that point, we've now reached the end of the first sentence. We've reached the disembarkation, and now we're off to the races, right?
Yeah.
And so, again, this thing of big things contained in small things is reflected even in the structure and the rhythm of the writing. And, I think for our audience, this might be sounding a little overwhelming at this point because the techniques applied here are very advanced, right? She's doing this at such a high level in such complex ways, but hopefully as we start to break it down, as we explain how different components of that work, you can start to see how you can pick and choose some techniques that might be able to be incorporated into your writing, or at least shift how you're thinking about how do I do some of the things? How do I create this feeling that I have at the end of the first few pages of this book?
All right, we are going to end here, and I'm going to give you some homework. I want you to take a work in progress, something that you've written or are writing, something you plan to write, and write 3 paragraphs, each describing a different kind of scale. Give us a scale of time, a scale of place or space, and then some kind of emotional scale, whether that is fear or joy or ambition or sadness, whatever it is. Give us a sense of those. Write those 3 paragraphs, and that's your homework.
This has been Writing Excuses. You're out of excuses. Now go write. Do you like stars? I do. Maybe you'd like to put up a constellation of stars by rating us on Apple Podcasts. Hello. Yes, we're talking about ratings, not astronomy. But a 5-star review can help us by creating a navigational beacon for new writers like you to find their way to Writing Excuses. So, rate us on Apple Podcasts or your podcast platform of choice. Let's talk about the rude tales of magic. In this improvised narrative role-playing podcast, join artists, writers, and comedians from Adult Swim, Cartoon Network, Comedy Central, Marvel Comics, and more as they fight and fumble their way across the madcap and exceedingly rude fantasy wasteland of Cordelia. Branson Reese and his Jester's retinue, Christopher Hastings, Carly Monardo, Tim Platt, Joe Lepore, and Allie Fisher star as a group of unlikely survivors, specifically a talking crow, a lich in a wig, a bubbly fawn, a Sasquatch punk, and a tiefling hunk. This group must solve the mystery of Polaris University's vanishment and return balance and higher education to their world. It's going to be very hard and very, very rude. Subscribe to Rude Tales of Magic on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes drop every Wednesday. Writing Excuses has been brought to you by our listeners, patrons, and friends. For this episode, your hosts were Mary Robinette Kowal, Dongwon Song, Dan Wells, and Howard Taylor. This episode was engineered by Marshall Carr Jr., mastered by Alex Jackson, and produced by Emma Reynolds. For more information, visit writingexcuses.com.